We proceed with our colloquium, and now in this session we have two speakers. They need no further presentation from me. They are Victor Neumann here present and Daniel Barbu. And we start with Daniel Barbu, who's going to talk to us about the twilight of society and the rise of unpolitical democracy. Daniel.
Thank you. I'll take over the conversation from a remark you have made in your presentation, and I wrote it down. I hope I was faithful in doing so. We haven't seen, after the demise of communism and everything else that went with that, we haven't seen the birth of a new society. So to me, the issue of society is a key issue in at large, not necessarily only in Romania, but I'll be discussing prominently the Romanian case. But I suspect, not that I claim a particular wisdom in the matter, so I'll be very cautious and humble in my approach, because I'm very aware that it takes a lot of wisdom to address a very complicated issue, this issue of what we are living in today. Is it society anymore, or something that deserves to be called otherwise? So there are two issues in my presentation. The first is unpolitical democracy, which is a rather well-researched topic. There are many voices and many scholars that addressed the question. The issue of society, I metaphorically said, the twilight of society, the vanishing away of society, both civil society in the sense of Hegel and socialist society in the Romanian case. There are both disappearing, and as Sorin noticed, we don't really see what replaced this society that replaced one another in the recent history. So, and I'll start my presentation quite from a quite distant past, contrasting, because they address the two topics, two authors that wrote almost simultaneously. I'm not aware that they ever met or had any kind of relation, even if one was a professor at Chicago in the 60s and 70s and later on, and the other more important in the large picture of the movement of ideas and the shaping of the academia in the 20th century, was a product of the Chicago School, but a professor at Yale, the professor of the likes of Robert Dahl, for instance. And the first one is Mircea Eliade, and the second is Harold Lasswell. Harold Lasswell, to my mind, in his seminal book, the book that might be considered a manifesto, the first piece, the cornerstone of political science as an academic discipline, published in 1936, Politics, Who Gets What, When, How. In the very first page of the book, he sums up somehow the knowledge of Anglo-Saxon, German, and French academia on society, in order to place within this knowledge his approach to what politics may be. And he defines society based on the whole wisdom from Durkheim and Mauss to whom he quotes in other words, Max Weber, for instance, saying, and I quote, it's like carved in stone, available values on which our society is founded may be classified as deference, income, safety. So 3 fundamental values that define what Hegel called bürgerliches Gesellschaft, what in English, and there are authors who claim that Hegel was inspired by Dr. Johnson, who called the same thing civil society, the civil society that was discussed intellectually up to the 60s, not the civil society reshuffled in the 80s, 90s, and even today it's a bit of discussion. The first understanding of that is the bourgeois society, based on 3 fundamental values: deference, income, and safety. These values articulate society and define the variety of functions and roles that individuals and groups play within this society. And all these individuals and groups are in pursuit, each on their own particular station, of deference, recognition, as Hegel would have put it, income, to have a decent life, plentiful, if the case may be, and safety. The other author is Mircea Eliade. Before becoming an important member of the world academia as a historian of religion, he was a right-wing journalist in this country in the 30s, and I quote 2 of his articles. I extract, in fact, out of them for my own purpose similar consideration. The 2 articles flank the book of Laswell. One is from 35, the other from 37. And in the first one of 35, he's less talkative and uses also a kind of lapidary choice of words, saying those who disentangle themselves from politics represent the last resistance of the public spirit in Romania. In the second article, 2 years later, where it's quite famous, well known, where does the mission of Romania begin? He is in this widely quoted or referred to, if not quoted, article, the terms of still unfolding debate, and he observed that the process of modernization could be deemed a failure in this country precisely because it was conducted, as he states, from a political standpoint. And he denounces the primacy of politics in liberal and democratic societies, and by imitation also in Romania. And he claims in a kind of prophetic, on a prophetic tone, that Romania is probably called to engage in something that would look like a, and I quote, a primacy of the spiritual, both anti-democratic and religious, and by means of this primacy of the spiritual, Romania, strange as it may seem, and he was not a prophet in this particular point, will one day dominate the whole Europe. It doesn't happen. It didn't happen, and it's not so likely that would happen in a short while. I don't know, in 100 years, perhaps. But nonetheless, why do I quote him? Obviously, I quoted Laswell for the idea of society, what was society in the mid-30s, the New Deal was triggered, and Laswell looks at it and how the New Deal reshapes American society. He looks also at Italy, not yet at Germany. He scarcely mentions Germany in the book, but fascism was there for a decade, so he had the time to observe it and consider it a model that is not that different, he considers, from the New Deal experience. And then he looks at the Soviet model, which he classifies somehow in the same family. So fascism, Soviet, Stalinism, and New Deal are experiences that belong to the same realm of human endeavor, and which purpose is to consolidate within society these three fundamental values. Deference, obviously who receives deference is different in the Soviet Union, in Italy, or in the US, income and safety. So Laswell, obviously, if we look at what is happening today in our society, in the American society, in Italy, or in post-Soviet Russia, was not a prophet. Somehow, in a very strange manner, Mircea Eliade looks like one. By denouncing politics, the primacy of politics, and wishing for the demise of politics like as a human agency. What we are witnessing today, and this would be my first observation, is what many scholars, I said this part of my argument is quite well researched and by very prestigious and quite different authors. I'll give you the definition provided 5 years ago by Nadia Urbinati in her Disfigured Democracy, and she defines political democracy as the name of a complex family that includes both proposals of extending the domains in which non-partisan decisions are made and proposals that advance a conception of democratic authority that receives legitimacy from the quality of the outcomes that its procedure allows. These approaches tend to neutralize that which makes democratic politics so characteristically associated with dispute, disagreement, deliberation, and majority decisions that are open to change. Other authors, the late Peter Mayer spoke about the democratic void, Guillermet about l'hiver de la démocratie, the winter of democracy. Few years, 3 years, I believe, before Nadia Urbinati, two German sociologists, Philip Weber and Danny Mikkelsen, already coined the term unpolitische Demokratie. So there are different ways of approaching the same phenomenon. Colin Crouch, a British sociologist and political scientist, speaks about post-democracy, and so on and so forth. What would be characterizing this trend, this reshaping of democracy as we know it and as we still study it in university handbooks on comparative politics, comparative democracies? We look and we think democracy is what happened in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the Trente Glorieuses, and so on and so forth in different polities, West Europeans, North American, or the third party, Japan, South Korea, or Taiwan. The decision-making process, first and foremost of major public policies does not correspond anymore to what was the ideal typical practice of liberal democracy. No matter how democracy was described, is currently still described in handbooks, normatively and empirically, it always entailed the responsibility of the state apparatus to an elected representative assembly emerged from free, fair, and regular elections with universal and equal suffrage. This implies that citizens were collectively and usually under the guidance of those political parties they trusted, the ultimate instance of approval, review, and rejection of public policies. Electoral support was the device used both to legitimate and also actually assemble the post-war welfare state. It seems that the dismantling of welfare follows a different path that explicitly excludes electoral consent. Also, although disagreement and debate are still possible, they operate in our societies, and especially in the Romanian one, within an overall model of manufactured consent and expert agreement that envelop without really masking the fact that political decisions are more and more taken not in parliament, by government or by party leaderships, but by insulated and somehow obscure instances where the best represented interests are the corporate ones, especially the financial ones. Daniele Caramani wrote extensively on that. I can provide an example from the very recent history of this country. The Romanians here may well remember that on May the 6th, 2010, the President of Romania announced that he had decided to take a number of austerity measures in the public sector, including salaries and pensions cuts. The government wrote immediately a bill to that effect, voted eventually by the parliament. The bill was reviewed and with a single reservation regarding the pensions was approved by the Constitutional Court. A few months later, the finance minister disclosed that the decision was in fact taken by a group of 6 people, among whom himself and the president, but not the prime minister, the names and institutional affiliations of the other 4 persons whose resolution put in motion the government, the parliament, and the constitutional court and affected the livelihood of millions of households remains to this day unveiled. Who are there? We don't know. Probably when some of these persons who write their memoirs will find out. So it's a splendid Romanian
writing kind, but anyway. Yeah.
It's a splendid Romanian example of an insulated decision of an utmost importance for the whole society, not taken in parliament, not taken by the leading government, not taken by the majority political party, but by a group of 6 people, 4 of them with identity unknown. We may think that one of the 4 was the chairperson of the National Bank, but this is a guess, and the 3 others remain somehow mysterious. So 4 key attributes may account for this unpolitical democracy. First, the will of the political community is manufactured from outside the electorate itself by a series of means of persuasion. Political life is reduced to its media presentation, if not marshaled by the media and the interest groups to whom the media belongs. It's no coincidence that this post-democratic term was first observed in 1999 in Italy with the advent of the second Berlusconi government. As you know, Berlusconi was not only a politician, but a media tycoon also. As a consequence, the public sphere is not anymore a realm of decision, but of mere rhetoric. The second trait is the complete takeover of politics by the logic of the global economy. Public choice theories already allowed in the 1980s the capture of the language of political science by the language of economics. In the 2000s and 2010s, global financial capitalism engendered in most countries of Europe and North America a self-referential political elite more concerned in establishing enduring relations with the dominant interest groups than in engaging in proper political programs. Yesterday evening on TV, there was an interview with the leader of the party that won the second best result in these European elections of May 26, and he said absolutely nothing about the program, but stated clearly that his constituency is the, as he put it, the active part of society, the entrepreneurs. He clearly, what's the program, what the entrepreneurs want, besides voting for his party, he didn't say. But he identified himself and his party as a kind of spokesperson and spoke group for the entrepreneurs, the economic interest of a very active and prosperous middle class. Outsourcing, public-private partnership, and the introduction of market criteria in the public services are the signs of this condition. Areas of public life that traditionally fell into the responsibility of government, health, education, pensions, welfare, are either contracted or privatized. Not yet the case in Romania for all of those. Therefore, governments become gradually less accountable and their dealings more obscure. The third feature derives from here, the fact that governments are less responsible and responsive to the electorate and more disengaged from the social concerns of the citizenry has led to political disaffection, measured by a dramatic decline of participation and the emergence of clear forms of depoliticization. The fourth aspect is manifested by a general crisis of political representation. More often than not, politicians speak on behalf of interest groups rather than in the name and for the benefit of their constituents. As a Romanian senator candidly pointed out in June 2010 during the legislative process that ended up in the drastic cut of income of the civil service, which I've evoked a while ago, his constituency is not formed by thousands of voters to whom he would be supposed to explain the necessity of such callous austerity measures, but by 10 to 15 entrepreneurs with whom he has to negotiate his vote in parliament. It's not Romania alone. I said the phenomenon, if you remember, it's a very nice movie with Tom Hanks, Charlie Wilson's War, based on a real character, a member of Congress that was instrumental in involving the American government, first the American Congress, in financing the Mujahedeens in Afghanistan in 1981. And someone at a point in the movie at a certain point asks him, but you are a representative from Alabama. Do you think that your constituents even have heard about Afghanistan? And Tom Hanks, Charlie Wilson, says, I have only 15 constituents and they are all in Washington. So even if I'm elected in Alabama, my constituents are in Washington, and certainly they have heard about Afghanistan and so on and so forth. Enough for the unpolitical democracy, because I've simply summed up scholarly wisdom that is widely available. I haven't invented much. I've just seasoned the knowledge with some Romanian examples, nothing more. The second issue is more tricky and complex, and as I said, I'll be very humble in addressing it, and I'll just indicate where my thoughts tend to go than providing real answers. And I'm start from a very famous quotation everybody knows in the social sciences and even outside them in the public realm as such, and especially in the political world, the famous phrase of Clausewitz that said that politics is nothing more than civil war pursued by other means. And my question is, if politics vanishes, is a shadow of itself, so to speak, if not completely absent in some societies, and Romanian society is one where politics is completely absent. If you look at the past elections, and not only at the discourses of the politicians, but in this occurrence, but in the last 2 or 3 years, there are clearly two camps, and their position may be summarized like this. A group says the others are thieves and corrupt, and we care about it, and vote for us. And the other group says we have put money in the pockets of Romanians, we have increased pensions and salaries, so vote for us. Where is politics in one or the other statement? Nowhere. So the first rely on mere ideology, which we have seen the first time the Nazis won a significant result in German elections in 1930, in November. Their slogan was Schluss mit der Korruption. And it was a solid fist crushing a group of politicians of the Weimar Republic. So that's clear. It's pure ideology and propaganda. On the other hand, it's pure economics. We have did well and we have increased the living standards. We may argue it is true or not, but this is another question. So it's nothing political, the great political virtues that explain modern politics and somehow underlie what happened in the 19th and 20th century, that's freedom, equality, and so forth, justice, mentioned by Dan Pavel. Nobody speaks about that. To quote just 3 fundamental political values, but there are others. So if politics is not, what are the means for our polities? I will not use the word society anymore, of our polities to avoid or at least to tame civil strife. War, civil war, has probably to have recourse to its own means if politics is no more not available anymore. And if you look at the Romanian polity today, you observe that as it was structured in the socialist period, if you take the official language, socialist society was a key concept. Sometimes, but the occurrences are far modest with respect to socialist society, socialist nation, sometimes the people. But fundamentally, the whole normative discourse of communism was organized around the concept of socialist society on the verge of becoming mutually developed. That was the goal, to develop in multiple ways the socialist society. It was a well-structured society in terms of deference, income, and safety. There was the working class, was the leading class, and it's easy to observe that in the 90s, the working class dies away. There is no working class today in Romania. It was at the beginning the miners' movement in the 90s, 99, were the sign of a working class that felt that it was doomed by history and wanted somehow in a obviously violent way to state that they are still present. We are here, we still count. That was what was behind what the miners did in 3 times in 1990 and once in 1999. To see we are still here, we didn't die yet, we are still moving and want to have a voice to get what? Not necessarily income, but deference, to be reckoned with, to be taken into account when decisions are made. Because remember, we were the leading class until the 22nd of December 1989. The peasants, the second social group of socialist society, not dominant group, but allied with the dominant group. I won't insist. Catherine Verdery published in 2003 The Vanishing Hectare, where she states, and she is absolutely right to my mind, at least, that the Romanian peasant is dead. The death of the Romanian peasantry was already recorded in 2003. There are farmers today, rural entrepreneurs, elderly persons living in the countryside, but not peasants. What about the intelligentsia? What about the intelligentsia? It collapsed also. The center of society collapsed. And it's interestingly enough that, and I am approaching the end of my few remarks, which I made in a rather interrogative manner. Than I don't provide answers, but I feel that there is a topic that is worth being researched and looked at very carefully. In 1980, Claude Lefort, in his L'Invention démocratique, epistemologically showed that democratic societies are organized around a void, around an empty niche. And in 12 years later, in a book that looked at the demise of communism, La Complication, he considered that this void, and remember Peter Mayer's definition of unpolitical democracies, the democratic void, even if Mayer did not quote Lefort. So the Mitte, which Adenauer famously considered that is the basis of the reconstruction of Germany, the social Mitte, the middle of society, be them farmers, be them working class people, be them civil servants, be them entrepreneurs, but they form together a Mitte of society that share this interest in keeping deference, recognition for groups and individual achievement, safety, and decent income. This Mitte has collapsed in all societies. The American society shows a splendid example, and the American society has measured its collapse. After the crisis of 2008, for the first time after the New Deal, workers' income, and statistically workers' income means all incomes. A worker in these statistics may be considered the CEO of a bank, but he receives a salary. It's not the owner of a bank. So all workers fell under 45% of the total national income, that is the GDP. That is a percentage reminiscent of the period before the Depression, the famous period of the progressive period of the robber barons, of the Morgans and Rockefellers, when the national income was concentrated in the hands of a few very potent industrialists and financiers. And American society reverted after the New Deal to that weight of the workers' income in the total national income. What about Romania? Strange as it may seem, the US, and no one is actually discussing, and this is and I relate the issue to my first topic, the unpolitical democracy. Nobody here discussed this very poignant political issue. The workers' income as a share in the GDP of Romania is today 36%. That is, the US, with respect to Romania, look like a working class paradise. Germany is 52%. Germany is really the paradise of the working class today in the world. Romania is among the last countries, at least in the Western world, North America and Europe, to have one of the smallest share of workers' income, that is, everyone who receives a salary for his or her work. So it's not an entrepreneur, doesn't work for himself or for the company he owns or he owns shares of. So this shows that the Mitte and the myth of the middle class, the Mitte, if not completely disappeared, at least has substantially shrinked with respect to 30 or 40 years ago. So to me, for the social scientists and the political philosophers, historians of the present time, it's sociologists. Do they have a job? If there is no society, what they are going to study? The task at hand is to look at what is taken the place of the civil society not the professional civil society of the 80s and 90s in Central and Eastern Europe that was financed, as you said, by the Department of State and other foundations and trusts in North America, and not only, but the real civil society and the socialist society that took in this country the place of the bourgeois society to disappear 30 years ago and leave something else or nothing behind it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if you add the historical dimension of this process, you get even more depressing conclusions, because the thing is, if you compare the situation before the Great Depression in the United States, the waged workers were not a significant part of society, because many people were living off their land, somewhere in the forest and so forth. Whereas after this process, you are talking of a society whose income is shrinking, while everybody is waged workers one way or the other. Where a more significant segment of society works for a salary.
So I would easily claim that the fundamental political discussion in this country should go on around the issue of equality. And nobody talks about it.
No. This is
equality is we live in something, a polity, not say society, that is highly unequal. And nobody cares about it.
Of course. On the contrary, for instance, poverty, very much like in theological discourse, is taken to be a precise indication of the fallen nature of the interested.
Exactly.
So you can only be, if you are destitute, this is a sign of, moral and let alone metaphysical condemnation, which is without appeal. And this is now the mantra that most public intellectuals repeat. It's like in a dream, in a nightmare of a Weberian, dogmatist who would believe that the process ethics is the answer to everything, because here it is an indication that indeed only the happy few who had been the chosen, very few chosen are worth mentioning, whereas everything, the riffraff, who has all the almost racial, medical indications of inferiority and of decay, constitute the majority of the population.
Yeah, if I can abuse the time, but I'll keep silent from this point on. It's interesting that this kind of political theology also infused the workings of the European Union.
Yes.
The very recent idea that cohesion politics, that is the way structural funds are allocated to different countries, should be conditioned by somehow of some kind of respect of some criteria, like the rule of law. And this is reminiscent in my mind, that's why I said it's political theology, to some trends of Scottish Presbyterianism that was rather successful in the US in the late 19th century, early 20th century, on the deserving poor.
Exactly.
That is, you should be compassionate as a Christian and give away alms to people that are poor, but they should be deserving your alms. If they drink, if they beat their wives, they don't deserve to be helped. So they have to have a moral standard in order to be helped materially with money. And it's interesting how this kind of theory is now infusing a European policy.
Absolutely. After the Transglorious. Now we move to the presentation by Victor Neumann, who is talking about Romania in contemporary Europe. Victor.
Thank you so much, Sorin, for inviting me here to speak about Romania in contemporary Europe. First of all, I like to put a few questions. Why we need to discuss the transformation of Romania after 1989? Another question, why we need to define the revolution of 1989. And why it's important to adopt the contemporary vocabulary in political thinking and in social sciences, not to use the interwar vocabulary or the post-war vocabulary, fascist or communist vocabulary, to define the revolution or to define the corruption or to define the transformation. That is very, very important. Is Romania really connected with Europe? This is another question, or with European Union. What about Romanian historical and cultural heritages? I like to mention here we received influences from the German school after the Second World War, the school of Bielefeld concerning the conceptual history and history of concept. They need in Germany to clarify the terminology, to clarify the concept. And Reinhard Koselleck, together with Otto Brunner and Werner Konze, they publish a lexicon in 8 volumes, very important, non-translated in other languages. I translated only one article about history, which I published in 2005. But it's important. Recently, I started to translate revolution, what means revolution in German vocabulary.
Democracy is translated in Italian.
Yeah, yes. I like to mention, it's very important, this GG, geschichtliche Grundbegriffe, Lexikon zur politisch-sozialen Sprache in Deutschland, because German scholars started to clarify 120 concepts inside of the German vocabulary, and especially because they restarted the German state after the Second World War. You cannot imagine to use we Deutschen in the television or in the media, because they started to clarify what means Deutsche, Deutschland citizens, or Deutsche Volk or Deutsche Kultur, because it's very, very important. Culture is it's a complex concept with many meanings. It's a mega concept, and we use in Romanian vocabulary for different issues, including identity, including ideology, including propaganda, including messages, etc. For everything we use culture without defining what means culture, finally. Okay, I like to mention here a few notes concerning Romania in contemporary Europe. The European Community body needs greater stability, more pragmatism, and a more precise understanding of the citizens' aspirations. In order to renew itself, it is important to contribute to the spreading of and to assume the shared cultural values. We have different cultures in Europe, but for citizenship we need to have the same reflexes and to share the same values, because we need the European relationships between different national people and persons. Of course, it is obvious for anybody that in spite of its importance, the growth of the commodity market or economic development does not necessarily entail a shared cultural conscience and neither a policy for the benefit of the middle class. Like mentioned Daniel Barbuk, the middle class is very important everywhere in Europe, including our country, including Eastern and Central European country. You know, we have a lot of problems in Eastern and Central Europe concerning the middle class. Regarding Romania, it can be a true co-participant to the European political issues and decisions only when its intellectuals will participate and bring their own contribution to the great debate of ideas of the continent, not only to be concentrated on the small circles or small countries, when they will consider the state and national issues in European context. This is very important to put in European context the Romanian problems or the Eastern European issues. Also, I like to mention here Romania has never, and intelligentsia and intellectuals have never discussed or very recently started to discuss the cultural heritages and the historical heritages of Romania. We have different heritages, historical heritages. Moldavia has Russian or Ukrainian heritages, or Polish heritages, or Turkish heritages. Wallachia has a lot in common with other Balkanic countries and regions, has also many in common from the Ottoman Empire, has a lot of heritages from Ottoman Empire, which is not bad, like was the interpretation for many years inside of the communist Vulgata or communist historiography. In the western part and the northern part of Romania, in the case of Transylvania or in the case of Bucovina or in the case of Banat regions, we have heritages from the Austrian Empire. I listened recently, somebody else spoke about Austro-Hungary. It's important to define this kind of administration. In 18th century, this empire was the House of Habsburg. In 19th century was the Empire of Austria. And in the second half of the 19th century was Austro-Hungary, the dual monarchy, Austro-Hungarian monarchy. There are three types of administration inside of the so-called same empire. This kind of heritage means a lot. Because, for example, in Transylvania or in Banat or in Bucovina, the first language after Romania was not French language, like in Moldavia or in Wallachia, was the German language. This is very important to know the German influences during the 19th century and the 20th century, when was created the national state. Because the Transylvanian scholars has a lot of influences inside of the old Wallachia and the old Moldavia. For this reason, it's important taking into consideration the imperial heritages for the Romanian identity and for the Romanian state. It became an independent national state, Romania, and part of the national and nationalist policies during the second half of the 19th century, like the old kingdom of Romania. The Romanian intellectuality born the stages during 1830-1860. Discovering and propagating the community differences based on history, religion, language, and culture. What kind of influences is here? It's a French influence, it's a German influence, it's an Austrian influence, it's a Hungarian influence. Okay, you can put the questions if you like to develop this topic. Those a new political identity and a new statehood have been born. It was the time when the transition towards modernity started, and when, by attending Occidental schools, like French schools or German schools or Austrian schools, the minds and behavior of the elites became responsive to all kinds of idea renewals. On the other hand, in the same period, the peasantry, which means the majority of the people, 90% in the second half of the 19th century, 90% of the population inside of the old kingdom of Romania, they were excluded from the public life, not only in contemporary history. During the modern history, in the second half of the 19th century, they were excluded from the elections process, for example. Inside of the political life, inside of the public life, they doesn't exist. Just to remember the revolt of the peasants in 1888 or 1907. In spite of those shortcomings, Romania rapidly covered the trail towards state modernization. Because of the elites, because of the connections with France, with Germany, because of the strategic position, geographical position, or political interest, economical interest from the western part. It cultivated the idea of European integration well before the actual admission to European Union. Many intellectuals were interested in the European integration and in the communication and relationships with different cultures. Less with Anglo-Saxonian culture, much more with French, with German, and with Italian cultures. What did the European membership mean nowadays? The decision to adhere to the Union was taken without any restraint from the political class, supported by the mass of the voters. Even the nationalist parties in the 90s or beginning of the 20s voted in this direction. Romania made remarkable efforts to be acknowledged a member state of the European Union. From the official request, continuing with the negotiations started in 2000, until the admission on the 1st January 2007, Romania covered the political and institutional administrative preparations in several respects, of course, not in every respect. The Romanian state has sent its representatives to all European institutions, and the Romanian citizens have become citizens of Europe, an important and practical step towards the process of assumption, the European values and identity. It was a promising beginning for a national community, often marginalized by Occidental policies. I remember from 19th century, this part of Europe was described with stereotypes. For example, from 1870 until the Yugoslav wars, Eastern and Southeastern Europe was described with many stereotypes that provoked the wars, the wars inside of the Balkans area before the First World War, that provoked the wars during the Second World War between different groups inside of Yugoslavia especially, but also conflicts between Romania and Bulgaria, between Bulgaria and Greece, the discussion nowadays about Macedonia, yes, or the discussions, permanently discussions between Croatia and Serbia. That was the consequences of the stereotypes created by the industry of consciousness, very well presented by Vesna Goldworthy in her book Inventing Ruritania. inventing Ruritania. It was an invention, this kind of stereotypes concerning the Eastern and Southeastern Europe. Started in 1872 and remained until nowadays. Romania acquired the right to be present at the common table of European politics, influenced by states with developed economy, administrative culture, performant judicial system, and strong democratic institutions. The Romanian state has recorded an important progress in this respect. From the pejorative formula of Balkanic state, as it was often described by international media and social political lingo, to the actual name of Southeastern European country. Even if the progress is slow, while the administrative, legislative, and political issues of the Romanian state are numerous, the pro-European social segment dominates the public scene. This is true also during the last elections. What is important, especially in a moment in which Europe is facing its first major crisis since the Second World War, is that Romania doesn't have any anti-European party. It's society accepting the European identity while pluralism is replacing unicity and idiosyncrasy. It's very important because has been stopped in many respects the chauvinistic discourses after 1990 in many circles, including the intelligentsia, including one part of the media. There are connections with Hungarian minority, very important from 1996, which means inclusion, not exclusion, inside of the Romanian institutions, and which is part, look, the discussions during the last weeks about the so-called conflict, Valea Uzului. They are very interesting discussions between Romanians and Hungarians to clarify this misunderstanding concerning the so-called conflict between two communities from Romania. The intolerant ideas and gestures have been partially transcended, persisting only in some cultural political discourses, in tabloid press, in the frustrations of small groups that haven't access to the normative culture and civility. For now, the European of this region is not impressed by the multitude of ideologies and forms of manifestation hostile to itself. Beyond the regional or areal peculiarities, we live in a time of a global conscience crisis, which reflect upon Europe in the form of populist ideologies. It was mentioned here the situation in Poland or in Hungary. Of course, we have also a few populist directions, which is important to analyze and to criticize or to clarify, first of all, what means populism and what means connections with nationalism, because it's contradiction in terms. If we want to be European in one side and to be populist in the other side, it's not possible to have both directions. On the other hand, the life of people is not satisfactory, like mentioned Professor Barbuk, neither economically nor politically or socially. Regarding the government and administrations of certain European states that promote geographical and linguistic frontiers, build walls or propagate neo-tribal messages, they do nothing more than oppose freedom of thought, expression and movement. Or in the absence of communication, empathy and interferences or convergences, neither emancipation nor peaceful cohabitation is possible. Philosopher Isaiah Berlin observed that the modern world needs to defend the liberal creative orientation, large areas of manifestation of different values and opinions. As for today's Europe, it seems essential to reconceptualize the relations between governors and governed, institutions and people, elites and masses. This is a problem in Eastern Europe and especially in Romania. The elite don't like to have connections with other segments of the population. If they are rich, they neglected the poor people. If they are intellectuals, authentic scholars or university professors, they don't like to talk or to have connections with workers or with other classes. This is the explanation why it was impossible the connections in revolution or before the revolution to have a program for the revolution of 1989. Nobody in Timișoara between the intellectuals has an idea about the program of revolution. For this reason, 2 or 3 persons from the masses started to write immediately the program of revolution. Lorin Fortuna and Claudiu Iordache and other people work not inside of the university or not inside of the intellectual elite. That is the singular issue that happened in Timișoara, and I closed this issue. In Timișoara started the revolution with masses. Yes, the mass revolution. It's possible in history to have mass revolution. Brodel mentioned this issue. In very few moments, it's possible to have mass revolution. It was a mass demonstration against totalitarian political system. A shared European construct depends upon an articulate and integrative political thought, a case in which the role of the intellectual and chiefly of the public intellect is fundamental. Inspired by the socio-political sciences, by anthropology and mainly philosophy, Alan Bloom mentioned without philosophical courses, we don't have a clear idea about political issues. We don't have vision inside of our job, inside of our institutions, inside of our profession. It's very important to have courses, philosophical courses for every group, not only for the faculty of philosophy. Yes. Without its reflection will surpass the obsolete or in vogue ideology, but especially the group, the exclusivist ones, the populist or nationalist group. In my book, The Temptation of Homo Europeus, that I have written long before the Romanian admission to European Union, I observed that despite wars, fanaticism, nationalism, Europe still remained the promised land. It promised a lot from Renaissance period until nowadays, and the periodic shifts illustrate this, especially in 18th century and from time to time in 19th century and in 20th century, rare in 20th century. But never the accomplishment have equaled the expectations. Every time Europe only acquired a new experience. Nevertheless, its current inhabitants possess different feelings and aspirations than their predecessors, who had died in tragic wars. Starting from their secular relations, from the common meaning of their cultures and institutions, they can conceptualize the modernity, having the opportunity to build the United States of Europe. Together with national state, in this moment, it's not possible to ignore the national state. It's not possible in this moment to think only in transnational paradigm. It's important to have the national state, but also to have this transcultural and transnational perspective or vision, because we need to cooperate. We need to have the same value, to share the same values, and to construct something. Romania has one part of the population, one part of the institutions involved in the European Union, and to connect through people, through intellectuals, to connect Eastern Europe with Western Europe. Of course, we must learn a lot, and we must change a lot inside of the society, inside of the political thinking. But first of all, to have a clear discussion and to have a clear dialogue about Romania in contemporary Europe, it's important to put the accent of for the key concept which defined political thinking, which defined institutional areas, which define what means Europe nowadays, because it's not like during the interwar period. It's not Europe of Nazi. It's another Europe. Yes, it's post-war Europe. It's a European Union. What means European Union inside of Europe? Yes. It's another aspect. 120 concepts were clarified in the DG, in the Geschichtliche Grundbegriffe. We clarified together with Sorin and with many other colleagues from Europe 20 concepts from Romanian vocabulary in the book Key Concepts of Romanian History.
And this work has to start all over again because,
of course,
I'm more skeptical about whatever they did with the big lexicon in back there in the 1970s. Work is still on the table.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have time to engage in discussions after the break, starting at 6. I just want to, so there will be a break up to 6 when we start the last segment of this discussion. And we get into the format of the ideas in the Agora that you know about. Before that, I would like to pick up just a few threads from the two presentations. Some of the parts, some of the second presentation I could listen to from down the stairs when I had to talk to someone who was supposed to pick up Professor Jan Drusen from the airport. But finally, this is over, it's done, we know he is alive, everything is fine. Now, to the worst part, I think, it seems to me, in the disappearance of the Mitte, is also the disappearance of a middle ground where people could still meet one another and have a relatively peaceful discussion about the cardinal projects of any society or even a polity. And this is the vanishing middle ground is one of the most preoccupying and alarming evolutions of the last 30 years. Of course, polemics, strife of all sorts existed before, but after World War II, there seemed to emerge all over the place in Western Europe a certain middle ground, an included third, which could at least be conceived. This is disintegrated today, and this is, to me, the most preoccupying thing. What Daniel Babu described here is the disappearance of the vectors of this middle ground. Who on earth could support, or, yes, initiate, or yes, support this middle ground for discussions, this place of negotiation, if the traditional Mitte disappears. There was an illusion which was fueled by transformations in America after World War II, but starting already under the New Deal, that the middle class would become almost coextensive of society. The ideal of a bürgerliche Gesellschaft seemed tangible, with the spread of well, decent income jobs, giving jobs, and a certain welfare, at least even in the American sense, well, a kind of welfare state. So the utopia, I would say at the time, from the 1930s on, would be the perfect equivalence between society and middle class. Of course, totalitarian states shared or even initiated a vision of organically integrated, completely uniform societies by also doing away with any form of deliberation and any form of politics, because everything was decided by the Führer. There was no interest in deliberation of any form. But visions of a homogeneous society were part of the utopias of the 20th century. Now, the Les Trente Glorieuses and the other success stories of the growing middle class fueled this illusion and this utopia of post-ideological society. You remember how around 1970, this symbolic year, discussions about the closing gaps between various societies and the convergence of ideologies were basically the dogma or the mantra for many living in dramatically different societies with different goals, with different social actors. But the discussion was on. Today, I think the Western, Western societies, post-industrial Western societies have to offer is the precariat as the vector for the middle, for the Mitte. So replacing the Mitte with the precariat seems to be the project of the modern West. This in a way, closes the problem of, for instance, deliberation, of recognition, because these people are used to living without any form of recognition. This need for anerkennung, for recognition, however you frame it, Hegelian or otherwise, or dignity, as some social theorists and philosophers developed after, more recently. This is becoming without an object, because, of course, these people living rather dangerously, the majority of the population living rather dangerously, not too much security or safety. Either anerkennung, recognition and dignity, very problematic. Now, the discourse, the typical discourse developed by Western societies is transferring these experiences only to the excluded. Women, immigrants, whatever, disabled, and so forth. But in fact, this is the discourse about the Mitte, which in the meantime has taken over the whole representation of society. And I see this as a very, very serious transformation. And in the last 30 years, obviously. So in many ways, what we are seeing in the West is not exactly the model we were hoping for in the 1980s. In many ways, Eastern Europe has joined this civilized world a little bit late, if not too late. Western analysts are generally blaming everything on the East, of course, to explain, the demise of Western societies as they were known up until 1989. But the crisis is as I can see it, there is a very interesting and alarming deficit of theoretical offers for whatever is going on in our societies in 2019. We still operate with a system of concepts and notions and paradigms that are predicated on the classics of social theory. That's a very nice thing, of course, to always go back to Max Weber. if you can read Max Weber historically. And if you remember that whoever was doing that a century ago in a completely different historical situation, in a completely different society. So for a while, classics of sociology, of social theory, of social philosophy, seem to be enough. And then, let's say, well, adaptations and innovations within this paradigm seem to be enough. 1968 signaled worldwide the crisis of this traditional system of references. But it replaced quite quickly the traditional system with an alternative born in the 1960s, also in very peculiar circumstances of the civilized, prosperous West. Then can you extrapolate that ideological and theoretical apparatus of the 1960s to the global situation of 2019? I don't think so. And I'll tell you just one little thing which is true of our integration in Europe. What Europe exactly are we integrating into? What has come of the European ideal, not only for the eastern part of Europe where things are, let's say, easy because you cast political, ideological, or moral judgment and everything is fine. But what do we do with Western societies which are obviously in a very, very deep crisis, which haven't been capable of offering a new social theory or a kind of new set of ideas for the situation they are in. If you take religion, demography with immigrants, cultural integration, these issues are really in a dramatic crisis of orientation and of definition. And it will be, of course, the task of maybe the next 30 years, if they can be imagined, to sort out this confusion and a kind of utopianism of a different kind, let's say more skeptical perhaps, having learned from the lessons of the last 30 years as from the lessons of the time before, considering basically the remaking of society, the reinvention of society, together with the reinvention of the political, that's politician. One example, for instance, this seems very big, but this is quite one example. Feyerabend, the epistemologist, the theorist of science, and so forth, in his book Science in a Free Society, as I mentioned all the time, he was very much against the experts. Even building a dam is not a problem for the experts only. It has to go through political deliberation. And his point was always that experts are wonderful, we have to train them, but we have to bring them into the political process rather than set them as no, Romania was better in the example that was given by Daniel before with the cutting of the salaries and all that, because you use anti-experts or non-experts to make that decision, you see. You don't even need experts anymore because you just pick up the political clients at a given moment and they take care of both the role of the experts and of the role of the constituency. They only need 3-4 people. Maybe in Romania, one would be enough to have a constituency, one member who is strong enough to influence decision making that you don't need. So, before breaking, we resume the discussion. I think 30 years later, what we have on the table is a long list of extremely provocative intellectual, theoretical, and practical challenges that it will be the business of the next decades to sort out and possibly solve. So, thank you, Daniel Barbu. Thank you very much, Victor Neumann. We break and we resume at 6 for the last part of this.